Welcome to Unpacking Armenian Studies and to this limited series we're calling Ukraine, Armenia, and War. This is our effort to explore, understand, and highlight the impact of this huge geopolitical historic event on Armenia and the Caucasus. Of course, Armenia and the Caucasus are intertwined with the rest of the former Soviet space and the rest of the world. And so how each of the other former Soviet republics perceive the war and how they are rethinking their own policies and alignments, these also impact Armenia and the Caucasus. And to delve more deeply into the real and the perceived and the shifting relationships, I'm lucky to be speaking with Dr. Robert English, a professor of international relations at the University of Southern California. Professor Robert English studies Russia, the former USSR, and Eastern Europe, focusing on general issues of regional relations and specific questions of ethnicity, identity, and nationalism. He is a former director of the School of International Relations at USC, and he also has an appointment in the Department of Environmental Studies, which gives you an idea of the breadth of his intersecting interests. Professor English is a great partner with us at the Institute of Armenian Studies. Our geographies overlap. And I don't just mean academically, we actually share a wall between our offices. Hi, Rob, welcome to Unpacking Armenian Studies.
Thank you, I'm happy to be here.
Rob, let's talk in these 30 minutes that we have, first about the perceptions of the other post-Soviet republics of the Ukraine war, starting with the Baltics and then swinging around to Moldova and the Caucasus and Central Asia. And I imagine all of that will necessarily bring us to questions about sovereignty and fears of losing sovereignty, but that's for later. Let's start with probably the easiest post-Soviet corner of the globe, the Baltics.
Yes, I think that's a good place to start. And I'll say at the outset that there are many shadings, there are many conflicting, complementary, and differing interests that shade each post-Soviet republic, each neighbor of Russia's in a different direction. But there is one broad division that starts right here. The Baltic republics are all members of NATO. They are integrated into the European Union as well. And that shapes, of course, their outlook and their security interests. So they have been in complete solidarity with the rest of Western Europe, the NATO and EU countries, in harsh condemnation of Russia. And if it weren't only that they're members of these bodies, they're also on the front line and feel that if this conflict expands, if Russia's appetite grows, they would be the next threatened. So it's understandable that they're in complete solidarity, anti-Russian solidarity with the West. For the rest of the post-Soviet republics, it's much more complicated. They don't have the protection of those blocs, of those alliances. And their geography, their economic weakness, and other factors, their own internal or their neighboring conflicts incline them in different directions. I will say one thing overall, I thought it was captured nicely. Every one of them is pursuing one form or another of what a Georgian analyst called the "don't irritate Russia" policy.
Yes.
At this critical moment, when the danger seems highest, not only because Russia is rampaging, but also because they understand least what Putin is up to, what he might do next, this sort of unpredictability and maybe irrationality that makes it exceptionally dangerous. So everyone is doing what the Georgians called "don't irritate Russia." They're just doing it in different ways to different measures.
And how is a small country like Moldova doing?
Wow, see, there's a perfect example. Let's begin in depth with Moldova. Moldova, again, everything proceeds from their unique domestic situation. Moldova is, as you know, a majority ethnic Romanian country, but it has its own frozen conflict. It has a large Slavic minority. This is the Transnistria Republic on the left bank, the east bank of the Dniester River, which declared its separation from Moldova. As I said, a frozen conflict. There you have predominantly Russians and a large number of Ukrainians as well. So this shades everything that Moldova does, right? In order to pursue a broad national policy, the current government, previous governments have basically understood that they can only lean so far in a pro-Western direction without aggravating Russia and bringing down sanctions and political problems. They can only lean so far in a pro-Russian direction without doing the same with the European Union and costing them investment and their sort of future that they hope will be European. So the Moldovan government right now, you'd say, is a mildly, it's a pro-Western government, but not quite as ambitiously. For example, they're not pro-NATO at the moment. They've declared neutrality. And they're keeping to that line that we have to, given this balance and this tenuous situation in our country, avoid irritating Russia, because Russia could threaten us. And here's an important point. The threat comes not from a direct military threat yet. The threat is what Russia has done in the past. It's economic and political, right? Russia can impose trade embargoes. It can limit, it already has limited Moldovan exports to Russia, but it can broaden those limitations. And it can do a lot of things. Of course, Moldova depends nearly 100% on Russian energy, electricity, and especially oil and gas. So these economic levers are powerful, and Russia has used them before.
Is Moldova receiving Ukrainian refugees?
Moldova is receiving Ukrainian refugees in the area of under 150,000 so far. And so this has begun to have an impact. But again, Moldova has been careful. Their leaders have essentially criticized the war, not criticized Russia. They have deplored the war. They have deplored the threat to nuclear facilities, for example, the Chernobyl and the Zaporozhye. They've declared, hurting civilians. They did join in the General Assembly of the United Nations, that broad resolution that criticized Russia. But in their day-to-day statements, the leadership has been careful.
And Central Asia?
Central Asia, roughly the same. As we go further from the conflict, I have to say that the war in Ukraine is less central, is less upfront in their evening news, in their newspaper coverage, in their debates. And that holds true here as well. Their local problems, their local issues. Kazakhstan has just gone through a revolution where Russia essentially led in the CSTO troops to save the government. So, of course, Kazakhstan is extraordinarily delicate situation right now. But again, you're right when you ask about refugees. The countries close to the conflict, like Moldova, and the Caucasus are a separate branch altogether. But the closer you are to the conflict, the greater the Russian threat. So the greater the fear of provoking the bear.
And the Caucasus, Azerbaijan and Georgia, before we talk about
this
Armenia.
is the most complicated of all. I would compare Georgia's reaction, both broadly in society and among the political elite, to Moldova's. Of course, Georgia's composition is a little different, but it leaves them in the same situation where Russia has used and can use, again, economic weapons. And by the way, let's add to that economic toolkit that Russia has, not just trade embargoes or restricting energy flows, but also the ability to block visas and interfere with the large guest worker population, right? Many Georgians work in Moscow and other parts of Russia, just as many from Moldova, many from Ukraine, many from Central Asia. So that's another lever Russia has and has used before, blocking visas, blocking money transfers, and those remittances are really important to Georgia as well.
Many from Armenia and Azerbaijan as well.
Yes, and Georgia, of course, Georgia is where I found that nice summation, don't irritate Russia policy, the pro-Western part of the Georgian elite. There are many think tanks, political parties. They're much more explicitly pro-Ukrainian, and they have spoken out in strong solidarity again and again. But the Georgian government, it's headed by the Georgian Dream Party at the moment.
Yes,
they have been much more careful to not irritate Russia and remind everybody that in addition to the economic levers, there is the so-called border problem, which is that even though South Ossetia and Abkhazia have now separated from Georgia, it's not accepted that that's permanent, and there's still a desire to keep those borders relatively open, to keep the possibility of people moving back and forth, of trade, for the hope for one-day reintegration, improvement of relations. And Russia can basically close those borders at any time because Russia has peacekeepers there and they control that. So the Georgians also feel that is a vulnerability to Russia. and they don't want, they don't want problems there. Now, of course, the ultimate threat is of an invasion and attack, and Georgians have already experienced a small version of what Ukraine is going through. But I think that they understand also that Russia is very preoccupied now. After all, it's taking troops from these regions and transferring them to fight in Ukraine. So I don't think anyone fears an immediate Russian invasion. But again, Russia's anger can bring both economic and political interference. Can I say one more thing about Georgia that applies?
Sure, and then Azerbaijan.
Which is that in Moldova, in Georgia, there are pro-Russian political parties. They're smaller. There are pro-Russian political forces, which Russia supports. Russia finances. Russia, in some sense, gives them orders, and they can complicate life greatly for the ruling parties, for the program of the political elites in charge. And they don't want Russia doing that. In Georgia, you have the so-called Patriotic Alliance. They are a minority party, but they can make trouble. And so far, they have kept their heads down. They have been acting in solidarity with the Georgian government on this don't irritate Russia, but don't give up on our Western ambitions, right? The Georgian constitution, like the Ukrainian, has enshrined in it the eventual goal of joining NATO, joining the EU. Nobody is calling for that to be removed yet. But if the Russians decided not just to take economic, but to interfere politically in Georgia, that's one way they could do it. And now on to the most complicated of all,
yes,
which is Azerbaijan and Armenia. And here, I'm going to say right at the outset, I should probably be asking you and my Armenian colleagues some questions because it's so complicated trying to figure it out. I see at the same time, certainly the don't irritate Russia, right? Don't bring Russia's wrath down on us policy. It is influential here too. However, there's the added dimension of the Karabakh conflict and what would seem to be Azerbaijan's efforts to exploit that to their advantage, meaning to exploit Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine right now to their advantage. And you know what I'm talking about, the recent diplomatic accord that has been the source of so much debate in that region, especially in Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijan seems to be, some critics say giving up some of its sovereignty, but in return for Russia, at least formally, pronouncing new words that sound like Russia recognizes our Azeri sovereignty over all of Karabakh. So it's not clear how to interpret those, but Azerbaijan is relishing the appearance of Russia tilting ever so much in their direction. And we know that practically speaking on the ground, Russian peacekeepers aren't keeping the peace. And Azerbaijan is emboldened by Russia's apparent distraction.
Given all of these specific interests and triggers for defining individual republic relations with Russia, let's talk a little bit about the reverse. I don't know, is there such a term as political empathy? In other words, where the republics understand why Moldova is in the bind that it's in, where republics understand why Azerbaijan is being attentive to not just Russia, but also Ukraine. Is there that internal space for each republic to play based on its own needs?
If your question is, are they looking at each other?
Yes.
Are people in Azerbaijan and Baku looking at Moldova's reaction, and people in Georgia looking at Karabakh and Armenia? I don't see a lot of evidence in these first weeks of the war. The initial reaction has been entirely our situation, our vulnerabilities, our relations with Russia, and fears of it being upset to their disadvantage. I haven't seen. It may be underway in some think tanks, a broader reflection, but the governments and main spokesmen are reacting immediately in terms of us. And that's part of the problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's 30 years of this. Exactly.
If they thought more collectively, and if there was more of an immediate instinct to consult and think about our common interests and how we might all be better served by coordinating. But as you know, on everything, there's been so little of that. And whether it's Russia's divide and conquer, whether it's the complexities of their own domestic issues or their own regional issues, it has impeded any kind of coordination and solidarity, and it does so now as well.
And in some ways, this is also a Western problem because, speaking from the Armenian perspective, being always caught in that very narrow space to maneuver, Armenia has always, if not vocally, but resented having to be stuck in a binary and having to choose. And now that the don't irritate Russia approach is taking on some favor, perhaps there will be, you tell me, perhaps there will be a smoother integration amongst these neighbors and republics?
Oh, I wish there could be, but I don't see it as likely, certainly not in the near term.
And what about the West's perception of these republics? Is there now any better seeming understanding that many of these countries, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, are stuck between a rock and a hard place and really don't benefit by having to make a choice while the whole world is making choices?
I think on the part of our professional, our foreign service, our experts on the region, there's absolutely that understanding. But again, we can't forget that foreign policy in our messy American democracy is also made by hotheads in Congress, people of good instincts, of good wishes, but less than subtle understanding. And so we can see backlash of the form, why isn't Armenia supporting us? Why are they so weak? They must be pro-Russian, without thinking further precisely about Armenia's dilemma. And so what comes out of American foreign policy when Congress is imposing sanctions, when it now will consider in 6 months or a year's time some bill that is of great interest to Armenia, I'm afraid that there is this deficit of goodwill and understanding, precisely because most people think superficially. Our professional diplomats understand better, but the results are often very difficult for Armenia. And it's going to be that way now, because Armenia, in trying to respond to this Azerbaijani campaign of pandering to Russia and trying to use the moment of Russia's distraction to their advantage on the ground with the peacekeeping, with their aggressive moves, has led Armenia to some public statements, literally a position. I think maybe I shouldn't speak for all of Armenia, but a couple of well-known Armenian political analysts that write, I'm thinking of this Pietro Shakarian and Benjamin Pogosyan. I'm not sure I've got their names,
Yes.
but
Yes.
writing in the Russian press, publishing for the Russian audience as well, taking the position that, look what's happening. You should be closer with us. You should tilt towards Armenia, because to favor Azerbaijan is to favor Turkey and NATO's encroachment on your southern flank. That's bad for Russia. NATO is the enemy. Therefore, you should tilt more and think more of Armenia's interests. That's a perfectly logical strategic position to take, right? The enemy, my enemy is my friend, but that could come back to be used against Armenia in some congressional debate or some testimony where someone says, hey, look at Armenia, they're speaking out against NATO, they're backing Russia. A subtle understanding of Armenia's political and economic dilemmas would preclude that, but it's not always subtle in Washington.
No, no. A former diplomat recently said, I was saying, no-fly zone, and how difficult that would make things, and difficult is an understatement. And the response was, this may be the one time where public opinion drives foreign policy. And well, here we go. Right. But let's put that aside for the moment. Let me ask you one Russia-based question, and then let's go on to sovereignty and security issues. Based on everything you've been reading and hearing from Russia, do you think there truly is an appetite to go forth and conquer? In other words, the fear of the republics, is it mirrored in Russia's or President Putin's rhetoric?
To go forth and conquer, no. But to act in an angry, spiteful, and hurtful way that damages these republics, again, politically and economically, yes. And it's simply a military fact of life. Russia, of course, is choking on Ukraine. The one thing I pat myself on the back for in my own commentary prior to the war, where I, like many, thought that Russia wouldn't launch a full-scale invasion, is that my reasoning was correct. I said, if Russia tries to swallow Ukraine, it will choke and maybe choke to death. And it is choking. So there simply isn't the military capacity to do anything else now. I mean, they are really stretched thin. And if they have to move troops from the Far Eastern Military District, if they have to take peacekeepers from the Karabakh region, if they have to invite in Chechen and Syrian fighters, that's a sign of desperation. So this is the moment, paradoxically, when Russia is least likely to launch other adventures. And I've always believed that Putin's obsession with Ukraine had to do with NATO in Ukraine. It had to do with his, strange view of Ukraine, Russia, and their national Slavic Orthodox history. It didn't, therefore, have to do with the South Caucasus. It didn't presage a move on the Baltics or anything else. And the other part of the answer to your question, of course, is who knows? Because when you ask what's coming out of Russia, does there seem to be a threat, an appetite for more? The answer is the only information that would help us answer that question is coming out of Putin's head, and we don't know. The people who are speaking, or that we listen to normally, defense analysts, some of the Russian think tanks, some that are close to positions of power, some former top officials, then we get insights into Russia's normal operation of foreign policy. This is so abnormal and coming so exclusively from the one leader, this fevered, I should say, deluded, maybe demented, and certainly detached from reality leader who did something so unpredictable that clearly many of his top military and intelligence people advised against. The answer is we don't know. It doesn't matter what anyone else is saying. They're as much at a loss as we are in predicting Putin's next move.
After those reassuring words, can we talk about how nothing is not predictable, but that there is no assurance of any sort of security left, at least in that part of the world, because what sovereignty and recognition used to promise clearly no longer holds. In other words, if the US could invade, enter Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, unilaterally recognize Kosovo, that was kind of tolerated. It was over there. And then if Russia could engage in Syria, invade Ukraine now. So now it's not just over there. Now it is approaching the borders of Europe and the borders of the West, and smaller countries are witnessing similar processes against larger countries. Ukraine and Armenia are not the same. And yet the same thing is happening. That is, sovereignty gives you nothing. Borders are not secure. And we can talk international order, but no one can implement international order. How is that for a confusing and confused question?
It's a great question. And again, I'm a bit of a realist and a bit of a cynic when it comes to the broad contours of geopolitics. I would be one who said 6 years ago, that it appears that we have a liberal international order and a law-governed system. We have, of course, the United Nations, we have treaties, we have International Criminal Court, but every so often, great powers just do whatever the hell they please. China does it. Look at China, right? Up in the Arctic, China is all for the law of the sea because they want their ships to be able to, sail unimpeded to Europe and back. When it comes to the South China Sea, there is no law of the sea. There's China's history and China's historic claims. So they're arbitrary and a double standard there. Russia, of course, is littered with double standards, and we occasionally engage in them ourselves. You mentioned invading Iraq with no Security Council backing on false pretenses. You mentioned recognizing the Kosovo secession, which at least violated some post-Cold War practices, that understandings coming out of the Helsinki process. So in that and many other ways, when it comes to trade, the same things, right? The big boys call the shots and they tilt the playing field to their advantage. And when we're lucky, we get these periods of a decade or 2 decades when we think that we've built something better and we truly respect sovereignty and everyone follows the rules. And then we're reminded every so often that powerful states, when they think it's in their interest, break those rules and violate those commitments. It's happening in a really big way right now. And it reminds us that there is no ultimate guarantee of sovereignty. There is no defense except defend yourself. It's a realist dog-eat-dog world, and it means that small states have to pay very close attention to the preferences of their powerful neighbors. And even though we don't invade Canada and Mexico, something of the same operates there too. In Central America, we still have a soft Monroe Doctrine. We tried to overthrow the government of Maduro in Venezuela. We still, embargo Cuba. We still tilt the playing field. We don't do it so brutally with such horrific loss of life so flagrantly as Russia.
And we
We're a
don't
soft version, but we do it too. Yeah.
And as Ukraine will attest, and we meaning the United States only does it where you know that the response will be asymmetrically minimal.
Yeah. And it's sad because, whether it was Georgia in 2008 or Ukraine today, following a period of calm, of following the rules to join the European Union, to participate in peacekeeping operations, to become a good international citizen, Georgia or Ukraine might have expected that, and that means you're going to defend me, right? When something bad happens, I'm playing by the rules. I'm trying to get in the good graces of the leading liberal democratic states. In return, can't I rely on you for help and to save my life when someone's trying to kill me? And the answer is not necessarily. And we're not willing to risk war with Russia. We bluntly say, Ukraine, you're not important enough. We feel for you. We'll send you arms and medical supplies and food, but we won't risk our own lives for you. Sorry, that's the way it is. And they shouldn't be surprised by it, but they are. The Georgians shouldn't have been surprised by it in 2008, but they were. I think Armenians are much more practical about that because they live with it every day. But it's sad wherever it prevails, and that is everywhere in the world.
You took the words out of my mouth. I mean, in terms of everyone condemning what is happening in Ukraine and everyone really doing very little to change the course of events in what is happening in Ukraine. At the end of the day, if there is no just and moral international order that protects everyone, and particularly the smaller, less powerful countries, is there possibly the beginning of an understanding of, I'm going back to my question about binaries and rigid expectations, is there at least the beginning of an understanding that there needs to be more flexible room for alliances, again, particularly for small countries, but specifically so that the larger powers don't then end up in this no-win situation?
There ought to be. And I think that in the immediate aftermath of a horror like this, for some period of time, at least again for the United States, because we go in and out, right? Our attention to the world, to Europe fades. But whenever this horror in Ukraine is over, or even if it drags on for months, yes, then we are keenly attuned to these subtleties, these issues worldwide, but that will fade. And after each reminder, we slip back in 5, 7, 10 years into business as usual, which is partly why these crises reappear. What I'm saying is that, let's say after the Ukraine conflict, whenever Putin falls, whenever there's a ceasefire, some kind of resolution, the US and its allies should remain engaged. They should be looking at the Caucasus, the spillover in Central Asia, and they should be far more engaged, thinking about the defense of those weaker countries, how to do it without provoking Russia, find some balance. But within 2 or 3 years, they'll be slipping back into their self-centered focus on American issues. They'll think about who has oil, and it's Azerbaijan, and those things will predominate. I don't see in the long run any major forward progress. I see post-conflict progress, attention, more subtle and beneficial policies, and then slipping back into old patterns until the next crisis. So I kind of see cycles more than I see steady progress. Of course, it's not as bad as it was 100 years ago, right? There's maybe it's only
I don't know.
Well, but the news media and
that's right, exactly,
make ignoring genocide, mass killing, slaughtering civilians, impossible. So it will never be that someone like Hitler can say, haha, genocide, who cares? No one remembers the Armenians, let's go do it. That can't happen again as broadly.
I don't know, given the attention span of the international media, and I don't say this glibly, I say it because when one problem is not resolved, the next one simply seems to be an extension or an elevation of the first one. And I'm speaking in this case very specifically of the following. That is, Azerbaijan did 2 years ago what Russia is doing today, and that is saying that, look, you are my people. You are part of my world. Now, in the case of Azerbaijan, saying you are part of my country, and in the case of Russia saying, culturally, civilizationally, historically, you are not just my cousins, you're my brothers. And in order to prove this point, I'm going to bomb you, which is what both of them did, one in a smaller scale and now Russia in a much larger scale. And this then leads to what? Where in history has this been a solution to something? Because it seems to me this is now just endless conflict between these two sets of peoples.
I don't know that I can give an optimistic answer to that. You're absolutely
Does it work?
right.
Does it work?
No. All I can do is repeat what I said before. Each time, compared to the 18th or 19th century variants and the millions that were slaughtered in silence, no one even knew, much less cared. At least there's more engagement, more attention. It moderates somewhat the brutality and the ease at which countries can resort to this kind of conquest. I have a historic claim, therefore I'm taking it, and I'm going to get away with it. And again, you accurately compare Russia and Ukraine with Azerbaijan over Karabakh, and we could come up with half a dozen other potential
Israel and Palestine, absolutely,
and in a moment's notice. They don't solve the conflict in the long run. I mean, is Azerbaijan enforcing a stable peace for the future that will last centuries? No. Can Russia digest half of Ukraine and peacefully rule over it for decades to come? No. So maybe that's when the pendulum will swing back, when the failure of these efforts. But of course, that means in the meantime, massive suffering and the international community tolerating this kind of foreign policy adventures. What's the word I'm looking for?
Foreign policy adventures.
Yeah, no, but I'm looking, but also not recidivism, but historic claims. China
revanchism.
Revanchism, yes. That's the word I was looking for, not recidivism. Although it is a kind of recidivism.
It is. It is.
And again, we had this lucky post-World War II period. When we had a bipolar world, it made everything clear and simple. Again, that's what the realists told us. A bipolar world is a simple world. It's a clear world. It's no fun if you're under the thumb of a dictator. If you're, in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union and you yearn for freedom and economic development, and you have a different cultural and political orientation, but the violence was suppressed. It was under control, and a lot of problems that we thought had been solved or we just thought were in the past came roaring back because there were these unjust settlements. We had millions living under hostile regimes. We had, of course, the Karabakh Armenians under Azerbaijan, and so many examples we could cite, and they were let loose by the end of this bipolar system. And as long as we don't return to a hard bipolarity, a real Cold War, where everything local is suppressed in the interest of the larger geopolitical contest, then they will continue to fester. And as much as people say we're in a new Cold War with Russia, and it's just like back to 1949, and Putin's like Stalin, Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's a small, weak regional power that can wreak havoc in its region, but doesn't have a global reach. And so we won't have that bipolarity in the world that suppresses all these small conflicts and keeps them confined. In fact, the other pole is China. And when we have multipolarity, then we have the worst of all worlds. When we have the greatest potential for the international community to be distracted, to be confused.
Way too many possible alliances, way too many
alliances shift. Yes, it gets very complicated when we're trying to lure Russia towards the West, but Russia turns towards China, but China wants to continue trade and good relations with the West. How does China respond to what's happening in Ukraine? They don't want it to damage their economic interests, but they like the fact that it's tying the West down and hobbling NATO. Multipolar world, a messy world. And I guess the takeaway from this is that the small countries suffer the most.
Professor Robert English, let me ask you a last question. As you went back to World War II and came into the Cold War, is it possible to say that World War II, with all due respect to Japan, really was not fought with the fear of nuclear weapons hanging over people's heads, and as a result, there were clear victors and losers, and so the Cold War and then the advent of nuclear weapons kind of solidified that balance that you referred to, predictability. We had the collapse of the Soviet Union in structure, in form. Is it possible to say that it is now just collapsing, that it really didn't collapse 30 years ago and it is now finally collapsing?
Haven't we had a few conferences where we thought, finally, after 10 years, finally, after 15 or 20? I think, yes, I agree with your point. This is an aftermath. This is a one of the end stages, the end game of the Soviet collapse in many ways, but I'm not sure it's done yet. And for the very reason you point to, because there's no clear victor, there's no clear defeat and no clear winner, right? In World War II, the Germans, the Nazis were defeated utterly. Their country was occupied. It was denazified to some extent. And the Western powers, drafted a new constitution, a new political order, and rebuilt Germany, right? But in the Cold War, Russia, the Soviet Union lost, but nobody was occupied, denazified, and rebuilt. The same people stayed in power. The same legacies of a horrible economic system, corruption, central planning hung over to the new order. And you're right, that's because there were no nuclear weapons in large measure. Had there been a clear defeat in the Cold War, and we had something as neat and clean as post-war occupations and rebuilding, then the post-Soviet era would be far better off now. But nuclear weapons meant that Russia retained this huge arsenal, and it didn't, denazify, so to speak. It didn't cleanse itself, and the old elites hung on with all the pathologies they brought with them. And we normally think about those for the economy, but now, as you point out, this is very insightful. You're pointing out that they had this even worse repercussions for interstate relations and for ethnic issues. So, yes.
Well, if we're going to go down that road, although I said last question, let me ask this one too. Is it possible that that collapse did not come specifically because of what you just said? That is, the old elites hung on, especially in the large country that drives this region, Russia. So this is a roundabout way of asking you, and you've referred to it a little bit, what are the possible outcomes of this, including possible division, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, if you can. And does domestic upheaval in Russia figure into this? And is that possibly then the door to possible final Soviet collapse and an opportunity for everyone in the region to move on?
Okay, I'll try to make it simple. There probably are 5 or 6 variants, but I'll boil them down to 2. One is a compromise. In other words, that there will be a ceasefire, there will be an agreement. It'll probably take the form of Russia holding on to Crimea, the Donbass region, and some additional territories to unite them in a kind of belt along the Black Sea and east, the border with Russia. So there'll be slight territorial gains. Ukraine will agree not to join NATO, and Putin will stay in power. And he'll, in some ways, claim victory. And probably he'll extract the easing of some sanctions, as horrific as that sounds, rewarding him for this adventure, and be able to hang on in power for another 5, 10 years, maybe his own lifespan. In that situation, nothing is resolved. Everything is as dangerous, and you can expect an angry, resentful Putin. He won't be in a position to launch another Ukraine war, but he precisely for that reason might take it out on the South Caucasus, take it out on Georgia or Moldova. That's a very depressing scenario, but it's the one that is probably most likely. The second is a collapse, a coup, a palace coup, that Putin is somehow swept out and Russia can start anew. But even then, I think you know me, always the pessimist on these matters. I think we delude ourselves if we think that Russia can finally, I think this is your question, finally be done with the Cold War, with the old Soviet Russia and start anew. If Putin were deposed, there will be some kind of junta, right? Some kind of group of military and intelligence political officials that will be a caretaker government. And then there will have to be elections. And I'm not sure that the Russian people will elect another liberal or Western oriented. It'll be another type of Putin, but hopefully one not so deluded, not so violent, not so irrational, but still a Russian nationalist, still someone who's to some degree anti-Western. And so I'm not sure that'll be a great improvement for Russia's neighbors either. And I'm not sure, in other words, that we'll finally have that break with the Soviet Union and all its legacies. We'll still see some of the same people hanging on, competing for power. The Navalny's, right, the young, democratic, anti-corruption, pro-Western, pro-market people are still such a minority in Russian public opinion. And I don't think that's, the aftermath of war is usually more nationalism and more resentment, especially with the propaganda Russia's being pounded with, and then the way Putin will spin this if he accepts a compromise, a ceasefire, where he doesn't take Kiev, where he doesn't conquer Ukraine, and just gets a little strip of territory. He'll still spin that in his own favor and in an anti-Western direction. So even that doesn't end the Soviet hangover.
Which means we'll just be speaking to each other for, months and years to come, it seems.
Yeah. How long, who would have thought that the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, can, in its legacies of ideology, of political, administrative, ethnic policies, keep living on into an entirely new generation of officials, of administrators and politicians. And yet it does in some form, maybe not quite as harsh as the first go around. There's no Marxism-Leninism anymore. But if anti-Westernism and Russian nationalism and great power statism is the new ideology, that simply isn't a lot better for Russia's neighbors than the one before, is it?
Indeed. Thank you, Professor Rob English.
My pleasure. You're very welcome. Always a pleasure to talk with you, Salpi, and to do anything with the Institute of Armenian Studies.
You're a great friend and partner. Thank you. I've been speaking with Professor Robert English, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Southern California. And we've been talking about the really, really difficult questions that are going to come as an outcome of this really, really very politically and historically huge, game-changing event that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We started the series a week into the invasion, and now 3 weeks and 8 episodes later, there are only more questions, and we will continue to ask them. Thank you all for following us at the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. This is Unpacking Armenian Studies. I'm Salpi Ghazarian.
You've been listening to Unpacking Armenian Studies, a podcast series on the Institute of Armenian Studies channel. This episode has been produced by Sadin Habesyan. Music by Josue Gonzalez. For more from the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, go to the Institute's YouTube channel to hear dozens of talks by scholars from all over the world. You can reach the Institute at armenian@usc.edu and follow the Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This podcast has been recorded at the University of Southern California, Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences.